The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the camp. The sound of boots shuffling through the dirt and the hum of distant chatter filled the air. It was another typical morning for the veteran who was busy cleaning his rifle. The metal gleamed in the early light as he worked, his fingers moving automatically, focusing on the task at hand. He had been through enough to know that in the military, routine was everything. The morning rituals, checking gear, scrubbing weapons, making sure everything was in order, were vital for survival. It kept the mind sharp, the body alert. But today, something felt off. As he wiped down the barrel, he noticed a strange sensation on his left forearm. It wasn't pain, just an odd tingling feeling like something was out of place. He looked down, expecting to see maybe a bug or some dirt, but what he saw made his heart skip a beat. A dark, irregular mark had appeared on his skin. It was small but unmistakable, a dark line that seemed to have appeared overnight. The veteran frowned and ran his fingers over it, trying to figure out what it could be. It didn't hurt, but it definitely wasn't there yesterday. His tentmate, a young soldier named Reyes, was finishing up his own tasks nearby. Reyes noticed the veteran's odd expression and walked over, his eyes scanning the mark on the veteran's arm. "Hey, what's that?" Reyes asked, pointing at the mark. His voice was low, cautious, as if sensing something was wrong. The veteran shrugged it off. "I don't know. Must have come up overnight." Reyes took a step closer, squinting. "I've never seen anything like it. That wasn't there yesterday. Are you sure you didn't get it during the patrol?" The veteran shook his head. "No, I'd remember if something happened." Reyes stared at the mark for a moment longer before stepping back. "Weird. Maybe it's just a scratch or something. But be careful, all right." The veteran nodded but didn't feel convinced. There was something about it that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the mark. It was the way it felt, like it was more than just a simple injury. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. They had a full day ahead, and the routine of camp life couldn't be ignored. "Anyway," the veteran said, grabbing his gear, "we've got patrol soon. Let's get ready." Reyes hesitated but nodded, walking off to prepare for the day. The veteran stood there for a moment longer, staring at the mark on his arm. It was still there, dark against his skin, and it seemed to be almost watching him, like it had a life of its own. Shaking the feeling off, he turned and walked towards the rest of the camp. But in the back of his mind, the mark lingered. He couldn't explain it, but it was starting to bother him more than he wanted to admit. As he grabbed his rifle and checked his gear for the upcoming patrol, he glanced at the mark one last time. It was faint, but it was there. And as he stepped out of the tent and into the morning light, he couldn't help but feel that something wasn't quite right. Today would be like any other day, he told himself. But deep down, he knew that the mark on his arm was only the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. The patrol was set to leave early in the morning. The veteran had grown used to the strict routines of camp life, and today was no different. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when he began preparing for the mission ahead. As he checked his gear again, the feeling of the strange mark on his arm tugged at his thoughts, but he tried to ignore it. "Everything good?" Reyes asked, walking over to him with his own rifle slung over his shoulder. "Yeah, just the usual," the veteran replied, keeping his voice steady. He wasn't going to let the mark distract him. Reyes, however, seemed more unsettled than usual. "You sure about that mark? Doesn't look like anything I've ever seen." The veteran looked down at his arm again. It hadn't changed much since he first noticed it, but the sensation was still there. A faint, tingling feeling as if the skin itself was more sensitive. He brushed it off again. "It's nothing. Probably just a scratch I didn't notice." But deep down he wasn't so sure. It wasn't like anything he'd experienced before. Soldiers got their share of cuts, bruises, and scrapes, but this mark felt different, as if it didn't belong. Still, there was no time to dwell on it. They were leaving in minutes. The veteran gave his rifle one final check and then walked out with the rest of the team. The camp was quiet, the only sound being the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. As the group moved out, the veteran tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the mark. The patrol itself went smoothly, nothing out of the ordinary. They walked through familiar paths, scanning the surroundings as they went. The veteran kept his head down, focusing on his steps, listening for any signs of movement from the forest around them. But something was different today. His senses were on edge. It wasn't the usual sense of awareness that came with being in the field. This felt like something more. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. He glanced at his arm again. The mark seemed to be there, more pronounced now, but it was hard to say for sure if it had actually changed or if it was just his imagination. He pulled his sleeve down, trying to forget about it. The mission was important, and his focus had to be on the task, not a mysterious mark. But even as he walked, his mind kept drifting, and it was clear that the mark was not something he could easily ignore. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was high in the sky. The team dropped their gear, exhausted from the morning's work. The veteran made his way back to his tent, hoping to finally shake off the strange feeling that had been nagging him all day. But as he peeled off his jacket and looked at his arm once again, his stomach dropped. The mark was still there, but it looked different, darker, deeper than before. He ran his fingers over it once more, trying to make sense of it. Nothing about it felt normal, but he couldn't explain why. "Hey, everything all right?" Reyes asked, stepping into the tent. He had noticed the veteran's distracted expression. The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood silently, staring at the mark, which seemed to pulse faintly like it was alive. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "This doesn't feel like nothing." Reyes frowned but didn't push further. He simply nodded and left the veteran to his thoughts. The veteran sat down, his eyes never leaving the mark. Something was wrong, and the more he looked at it, the more he realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. Night had fallen by the time the veteran finally decided to try and get some sleep. The camp was quieter now, with most of the soldiers resting after a long day. The veteran lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling of his tent, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept racing, thinking about the mark, about the way it felt, how it seemed to grow and change. Every time he closed his eyes, he could almost feel it pulling at him, calling him to figure out what was going on. But he knew that whatever it wasn't something he could easily explain. Suddenly there was a noise, a faint sound like something brushing against the outside of the tent. The veteran's eyes snapped open. He sat up, immediately alert, his hand reaching for his rifle by his side. The sound came again, this time more distinct. A soft, scraping sound, as though someone or something was moving around the perimeter of the camp. He listened closely, his heart rate picking up. It wasn't the usual noises from the forest, wind, animals, or the occasional shift of the camp itself. This was different. This was something deliberate. Slowly, the veteran got to his feet and grabbed his rifle. He moved silently to the entrance of the tent, peering out into the darkness. The camp was quiet, but the noise had stopped, replaced by the stillness of the night. He strained his ears, but there was nothing. For a moment, he considered going back to bed, chalking it up to his mind playing tricks on him. But the unease in his gut wouldn't let him. He stepped outside, staying low to the ground, scanning the shadows for any movement. The campfires cast long shadows, flickering in the breeze. That's when he saw it, a figure moving in the distance just beyond the tree line. It was far enough that the veteran couldn't make out details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone was out there. His first instinct was to grab a few of the other soldiers, but something stopped him. There was something off about the figure, something that felt wrong. Instead, he decided to investigate alone, moving cautiously through the trees, careful not to make a sound. As he drew closer, the figure didn't seem to notice him. It was standing still, facing away from him, almost like it was waiting for something. The veteran's grip tightened on his rifle, his eyes narrowed. He had no idea who or what it was, but his instincts told him it wasn't good news. He was about to call out when the figure suddenly turned and vanished into the trees, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow. The veteran stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been too slow, too distracted. Whoever or whatever it was gone now. But as he stood there, staring into the empty space, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The mark on his arm, the figure in the woods, the feeling that had been nagging him all day, it all seemed connected somehow. But how? What was going on? His mind raced, but there was nothing he could do right now. He couldn't waste any more time out here in the dark. He had to get back to camp to figure this out in the morning. But the eerie feeling stayed with him, lingering like a shadow in the back of his mind. Something was coming, something he couldn't ignore. The night was unusually quiet after the strange figure disappeared into the trees. The veteran walked back to camp, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of his boots on the dirt path. His mind kept racing, replaying the figure he had seen in the woods. Who was it? What were they doing here? As he entered the camp, he noticed that things seemed off. The usual chatter between soldiers had quieted down, and the atmosphere felt heavier, like everyone was on edge. He couldn't explain why, but it felt like the entire camp was holding its breath. He made his way to his tent, trying to ignore the growing unease. Reyes was already there, sitting on his cot, cleaning his rifle. He looked up when the veteran entered and gave him a quick nod, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he, too, felt the tension in the air. "You good?" Reyes asked, his voice low. The veteran didn't answer right away. He just nodded and began to remove his gear. The mark on his arm was still there, still faintly pulsing, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. It was almost as if it was calling out to him, urging him to understand what was happening. But how could he? He didn't even know where to start. "I saw someone," the veteran said suddenly, breaking the silence. Reyes looked up, his eyebrows furrowing. "Someone? What do you mean?" "I went out for a quick look around," the veteran explained. "I saw a figure. Didn't get a good look, but it was out there in the trees, just standing still, waiting, I guess." Reyes seemed to process this for a moment. "What do you think it was? A scout? Someone from another team?" "I don't know," the veteran said, shaking his head. It didn't feel right. Whoever it was, they didn't seem like they were supposed to be there. Reyes stood up and checked the door flap of the tent, making sure it was secure. "We should be careful. You're not the only one who's been feeling off tonight. Some of the others are on edge too. Maybe we should stay sharp." The veteran nodded. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he felt like something big was coming, something they weren't prepared for. The mark on his arm, the figure in the woods, the strange tension in the camp. It was all connected. But how? He sat down on his cot, trying to ignore the racing thoughts, but his mind kept going back to the mark. It was still there, dark against his skin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a random scratch. As he lay down to try and sleep, the sounds of the night felt louder than usual. The wind, the rustling of the trees, and the distant chatter of the other soldiers all felt strangely unsettling. But what bothered him most was the silence that seemed to hang heavy over everything, as if the entire camp was holding its breath. And then it came again, faint at first, just a soft whisper. It was almost like a voice, but the veteran couldn't make out the words. He sat up quickly, his hand reaching for his rifle. But the sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started. The veteran strained his ears, listening intently. Nothing. Just the wind and the usual sounds of the night. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of his perception, wouldn't leave. He glanced over at Reyes, who was still sitting on his cot, but now he was looking toward the entrance of the tent. His expression was tense. "You hear that?" Reyes asked quietly. The veteran nodded, his instincts on high alert. "Yeah, we're not alone." The next morning, the veteran woke up with a feeling of dread hanging over him. The strange noises from the night before still echoed in his mind. He had barely slept, his thoughts constantly returning to the mark on his arm and the strange figure in the woods. The camp felt different too. People were quieter, more cautious, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. The veteran got up and began his morning routine, but as he pulled his sleeve up to wash his face, his breath caught in his throat. The mark on his arm was different. It had spread. What had once been a small, dark line had grown wider and more defined. It almost looked like some kind of symbol now, something ancient and foreign, but it was still faint enough that no one else seemed to notice. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the strange texture. It was as if the skin around the mark was somehow different, softer, almost like it was alive. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a scratch or an injury. Something more was at play here. Reyes entered the tent just as the veteran was examining the mark. He paused, noticing the veteran's concerned expression. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Reyes asked, walking over to him. The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his sleeve down and grabbed his gear. The camp was already stirring with activity, and they had duties to attend to. He wasn't sure if it was a good idea to tell Reyes about the mark yet. He didn't want to panic anyone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something bad. As the day went on, the veteran couldn't stop thinking about the mark. It felt like it was slowly taking over his body, spreading further with every passing hour. He tried to push it out of his mind, focusing on his patrol duties, but every time he moved, it felt like the mark was pulling at him, as if it was trying to tell him something. During a break in the afternoon, the veteran and Reyes were sitting by the fire, eating their rations. The veteran glanced down at his arm again, and this time he saw something that made his blood run cold. The mark was no longer just on his arm. It was on his hand too. It had spread overnight, curling around his wrist and across the back of his hand. "What the hell is happening?" the veteran muttered under his breath. Reyes noticed his gaze and followed it to his arm. "That wasn't there before," he said, his voice full of concern. The veteran nodded, unable to speak. His mind was racing. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to find them. The mark, the strange events, the feeling of being watched, it was all connected, but how? He had no idea. But one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse. The night settled in quickly over the camp, and the veteran found himself lying in his cot, wide awake. The sounds of the night were familiar, the wind rustling through the trees, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional distant murmur of voices. But there was something off tonight. The air felt heavier, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He turned over on his cot, his eyes scanning the shadows of the tent. Every noise seemed louder tonight. Every gust of wind, every movement in the camp felt amplified. His thoughts kept returning to the figure he saw in the woods earlier. Who was that person? And why did it feel like they were watching him? The image of the figure lingered in his mind, like a ghost he couldn't shake. The veteran glanced over at Reyes, who was sitting on the edge of his own cot, cleaning his rifle. He seemed lost in thought, just like the veteran. The tension between them was thick, but neither said anything. The silence stretched out, each of them trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few moments, the veteran finally spoke. "I saw someone earlier tonight, out in the woods." Reyes looked up, his face tightening. "What do you mean someone? Like another soldier?" "I don't know," the veteran replied. "I saw a figure out there, just standing still. Too far away to see clearly, but it was there. And it wasn't moving like a soldier would." Reyes stared at him for a moment, processing the information. Could it have been a scout, someone from another camp? The veteran shook his head. It didn't feel like that. It felt different, like it wasn't supposed to be there. Reyes stood up and moved to the entrance of the tent, checking to make sure it was secure. The veteran noticed how cautious he was, as if expecting something to happen. "We should be careful," Reyes said. "It's not just you. I've been hearing strange things all night. Whispers, creaking noises like something's moving around the camp." The veteran stood up, his instincts kicking in. He had always trusted his gut, and right now his gut was telling him to stay alert. "I'll keep an eye out," he said. "Something doesn't feel right. I don't know what it is, but I think we're being watched." Reyes nodded, but his expression was full of concern. "If anything happens, we need to be ready." The veteran walked toward the entrance of the tent, looking out into the darkness. The camp was quieter now. Most of the soldiers either asleep or keeping to themselves. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, the rustle of the trees, seemed muffled, distant, like they were happening far away. But he knew better than to ignore his instincts. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the shadows. The campfires flickered in the distance, casting long, moving shadows on the ground. The veteran's heart raced as he listened, every little sound making him jump. But all he saw was darkness. For a moment he thought maybe he was just imagining things. But then, just at the edge of the camp, he saw it again, the figure. It was far enough that he couldn't make out details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone was out there, standing still in the trees, not moving, not making a sound. The veteran's grip tightened on his rifle. He considered calling out, alerting the others, but something told him to stay quiet. The figure hadn't noticed him yet, and he didn't want to risk drawing attention to himself. He crouched low, moving toward the figure slowly, careful not to make a sound. The closer he got, the more the figure seemed to blend into the shadows, until it was nothing but a dark shape against the trees. But just as he was about to get close enough to see who or what it was, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. It vanished as if it had melted into the night. The veteran stood frozen, his heart pounding. He hadn't heard a single movement. It was as if the person had never been there. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing. What was going on? Who was that person? And why did it feel like they were watching him? His instincts told him to go after them, but the veteran knew better. It was too late. Whatever it was gone. He slowly made his way back to the camp, trying to keep his thoughts focused. When he returned to his tent, Reyes was still sitting on his cot, looking up at him. "Did you see anything?" Reyes asked. The veteran shook his head, but the unease in his chest hadn't gone away. "No, nothing." But as he lay down to try and sleep, the feeling lingered. Something was out there, and it wasn't going away. The morning came too quickly, the veteran thought as he rubbed his eyes and sat up in his cot. He hadn't slept much, his mind still racing from the events of the night. The figure in the woods, the strange noises, and the feeling that something wasn't right. They were all still fresh in his mind. But there was something else on his mind now, the mark on his arm. He pulled up his sleeve and glanced at it, expecting it to be the same as before. But it wasn't. The mark had spread. It was darker now, thicker, and had expanded from his forearm all the way down to his wrist. It wasn't just a line anymore. It had started to curve and form shapes, almost like a symbol he didn't recognize. His breath caught in his throat. He ran his fingers over the mark, trying to make sense of it, but it was like nothing he had ever seen before. It didn't hurt, but it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. He stood up quickly and grabbed his jacket covering the mark. He didn't want anyone to see it. Not yet. But as he moved around the tent, getting ready for the day, his mind kept returning to it. What was happening? Why was it spreading? And what did it mean? Reyes entered the tent, looking over at him with a raised eyebrow. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his sleeve down, trying to ignore the feeling in his gut. "I don't know, just not feeling right." Reyes gave him a concerned look. "That mark, have you seen anything like it before?" The veteran shook his head. "No, I don't know what it is." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, his expression growing serious. "You sure it's nothing? Because that doesn't look normal." The veteran didn't reply. Instead, he walked toward the door of the tent, trying to shake off the growing unease. He needed to focus. There were things to do today, and he couldn't let the mark or whatever was going on distract him. But even as he stepped outside, his mind was still on the mark. He glanced around the camp, trying to stay calm. He knew something was off. The figure from last night, the whispers, and the mark, everything was starting to feel connected. The day went by in a blur. The veteran tried to push the thoughts out of his head, focusing on his duties, but it was hard to ignore the sense of dread that clung to him. As he went about his tasks, he noticed that other soldiers seemed to be acting differently too. They were quieter, more on edge, as if they sensed something was coming. By the time he returned to his tent, the mark had spread even more. It was now on his hand, curling around his fingers like it was growing into his skin. It was undeniable now. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a random injury. Something was happening, and the veteran didn't know how to stop it. Reyes came into the tent, his eyes immediately falling on the mark. "What the hell, man? It's all over your arm now." The veteran nodded, feeling a cold sweat forming on his forehead. "I don't know what it is, but it's getting worse." Reyes stepped closer, his eyes wide with concern. "You think this is some kind of infection? Something from the environment?" The veteran shook his head. "No, this isn't normal. I've never seen anything like it." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "We need to figure this out. Fast." The veteran agreed, but as he sat there, he couldn't help but feel like they were running out of time. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just physical. It was connected to the strange figure in the woods, the whispers, and the growing tension in the camp. And if they didn't figure it out soon, things were going to get a lot worse. The sun was setting when the veteran decided to step outside his tent. The camp was quieter than usual, and the mark on his arm had only worsened. It was now not just on his arm, but spreading across his chest and down his side. It felt like something was taking over his body, and the more he looked at it, the more it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to be done. He met up with Reyes by the campfire, but Reyes didn't need to ask how the veteran was feeling. He could see it in the veteran's face. They hadn't spoken much that day, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them that something wasn't right. "Have you heard anything weird lately?" the veteran asked, glancing over at his shoulder. He was scanning the camp for any sign of movement, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Reyes gave him a sharp look. "You mean besides the strange noises and the feeling like we're being watched?" "Yeah, I've been hearing whispers. Late at night, when everyone's supposed to be asleep. It's been bothering me. Doesn't feel like any kind of normal camp chatter." The veteran frowned. "I've been hearing those whispers too. It's like someone's trying to get our attention, but we can't understand what they're saying." "I know what you mean," Reyes replied. "It's been happening for a while now. I think something's going on. This camp, it's not the same. It's like we're stuck in some kind of strange nightmare." The veteran nodded. He had been feeling the same way. Everything about this place felt wrong. The mark, the whispers, the figure in the woods, it was all connected somehow, but he didn't know how to make sense of it. As the night grew darker, the veteran decided to take a walk around the camp. He needed some space to think. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. He walked past several tents, making sure not to disturb anyone. His mind was spinning with thoughts about the mark, the figure, and everything that had happened so far. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to look. As he rounded a corner, something caught his eye. A movement in the shadows. The veteran froze, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what he had seen, but it was enough to make him stop in his tracks. It was a figure standing still just out of sight, hidden by the dark corners of the camp. The veteran couldn't make out details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Whoever it was, they were watching him. His first instinct was to call out to Reyes, but something told him to stay quiet. This was different. He had to find out what was going on. Slowly he crept forward, trying to get a closer look. The figure didn't move. It stood there perfectly still, as if waiting for him. The veteran took a deep breath and stepped forward, moving silently in the darkness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he got closer. His mind was racing with questions, but he kept his focus. He had to see who or what was out there. He stepped around the corner, and then he saw it. The figure wasn't a person at all. It was something else, something unnatural. Its shape was distorted, like it didn't belong in this world. The veteran's blood ran cold. The creature, if that's what it was covered in strange markings, just like the one on his arm. It was standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly as it stared right at him. The veteran took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was looking at, but it wasn't something he could ignore. The creature tilted its head, as if curious, but it didn't make a sound. It just watched him. The veteran's mind raced. What the hell was this thing? Why was it here? Was it somehow connected to the mark on his arm? Before he could think further, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. The veteran stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what he had just seen. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with him. Without a word, the veteran turned and hurried back to his tent. His mind was spinning. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. The figure and the creature were all part of the same mystery, and he had to find out the truth before it was too late. The next morning, the veteran could barely bring himself to get out of bed. He had barely slept, his mind consumed by the image of the creature he had seen the night before. It wasn't just some trick of the light or a hallucination. He knew what he had seen. Something out there was watching him, and it wasn't human. The mark on his arm had spread again overnight. It now crawled up his neck, reaching the base of his skull. The veteran's fingers trembled as he touched it, the skin feeling hot and foreign beneath his fingertips. It wasn't just a mark anymore, it was a part of him, and it wasn't going away. Reyes entered the tent, looking worried. "You okay? You look rough." The veteran nodded but didn't say anything. He wasn't okay. Not at all. He couldn't explain it, but everything felt wrong. The camp, the mark, the strange creature, it was all connected, but he couldn't figure out how. "We need to talk," the veteran said quietly, his voice low. "Last night, I saw something." Reyes raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You saw the figure again." The veteran nodded. It wasn't just a person. It was something else. Something strange. It had the same markings as the one on my arm. Reyes stared at him, his face going pale. You think it's connected? The mark? The creature? The veteran nodded. I don't know how, but I think it is. Whatever this thing is, it's linked to what's happening to me. And I don't think we're safe here anymore. Reyes didn't respond right away. He just stared at the veteran, his expression serious. After a moment he spoke. We need to get out of here. Whatever's going on, it's getting worse. The whispers, the figure, the mark, it's all connected. But we're not going to figure it out by sitting around here. The veteran agreed, but a part of him hesitated. He had spent so much time in this camp, and something about leaving felt like a bad idea. But he couldn't ignore the growing feeling of dread. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse every day. They packed their things quickly, preparing to leave the camp. As they gathered their gear, the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he turned around, it felt like someone or something was following him. When they finally left the camp, the veteran felt a strange sense of relief. But the mark on his arm burned with intensity, as if warning him. Something was out there, waiting for them, and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. As they made their way through the dense woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The whispers, the strange figure, the mark, all of it seemed to be building to something, but the veteran couldn't tell what. He didn't know if they were running toward danger or away from it. But one thing was certain, whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until they found out the truth. And that truth was something neither of them were ready for. The veteran and Reyes walked through the dense forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves beneath them. The weight of their packs was barely noticeable, but the sense of unease that had settled over them was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the whispers or the strange figure in the woods anymore. It was everything, the mark, the growing tension, and the feeling that something was out there watching them. As they moved deeper into the woods, the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then he would glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see the creature from last night standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the endless trees and the sound of the wind in the leaves. Reyes, walking a few steps ahead, didn't seem to notice. He was focused, scanning the area for any signs of danger. But even he couldn't hide the look of concern on his face. He knew something was wrong. They both did. We need to find out what's happening, the veteran said, breaking the silence. We can't just keep running. We need answers. Reyes nodded. I agree. But where do we even start? We have no idea what this thing is or how it's connected to the mark on your arm. I don't know, the veteran admitted. But I've been thinking. We've been hearing whispers, right? Maybe it's a clue. Maybe someone or something wants us to find out what's going on. Reyes stopped walking and turned to face him. You think it's trying to communicate with us? The veteran shrugged. I don't know, but it's worth looking into. We've been feeling this way for too long to ignore it. They continued walking in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The trees around them seemed to close in the darkness of the forest, making it harder to see. The veteran's mind kept circling back to the mark on his arm. It had spread again overnight, now covering his entire arm and creeping up his neck. It was like it had a life of its own, constantly shifting and changing. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it hidden. As they walked deeper into the woods, they came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for years, the wood rotting and the windows boarded up. But something about it felt different. It didn't belong here in this quiet, untouched part of the forest. It was too out of place. The veteran stopped in front of the cabin, his heart pounding. Something told him they needed to go inside. He motioned to Reyes, who raised an eyebrow but followed him toward the door. As they stepped inside, the smell of decay hit them immediately. The air was thick and stale, and the floor creaked under their weight. It was dark inside, the only light coming from the cracks in the boarded-up windows. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the room for anything that might explain what was going on. There was nothing in the cabin at first glance, just old furniture, broken shelves, and dust everywhere. But as the veteran moved toward the back of the room, he noticed something strange. A strange symbol was carved into the floor. It was familiar, almost like the mark on his arm, but larger and more intricate. The veteran knelt down, running his fingers over the symbol. It was cold, as if it had been there for a long time. This looks like the mark, the veteran said quietly. It's the same, but bigger. Reyes crouched next to him, his eyes widening as he studied the symbol. What does it mean? I don't know, the veteran said, standing up. But I think we're getting closer. This symbol has to be important. Maybe it's connected to the creature, to the mark, to everything. The veteran stepped back, looking around the cabin for more clues. There was nothing else of interest, just more old furniture and dust. But the symbol was enough. They needed to find out what it meant. I think we need to go back to the camp, the veteran said, his voice firm. We need to figure out who did this, who carved this symbol. Someone has to know what's going on. Reyes nodded. But we can't go back empty-handed. We need more information. If we're going to figure this out, we need to find someone who can help us. The veteran agreed. They couldn't keep running. They needed to understand what was happening and why. And this symbol, whatever it meant, was the key. They had to find out the truth. As they turned to leave the cabin, the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air around them felt charged, as if something was waiting to make its move. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far to stop. The veteran and Reyes made their way back to camp with a renewed sense of urgency. The strange symbol in the cabin had left them with more questions than answers, but it was the first real clue they had found. They needed to figure out what it meant and, more importantly, how it was connected to the mark on the veteran's arm. As they approached the camp, the veteran's heart began to race. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, like eyes were following them from every direction. He glanced around nervously, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. Something didn't feel right. Reyes noticed his tension and glanced around too. What's wrong? I don't know, the veteran replied, his voice low. It's like someone's been waiting for us. They continued walking, trying to keep their pace steady, but the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The whispers had grown louder in the past few days, and now they were accompanied by an eerie silence. It was like the entire camp was holding its breath. As they entered the camp, things were eerily quiet. The usual chatter and movement were absent. Soldiers were either in their tents or standing around in small tense groups. The veteran felt the weight of their stares as they passed by. It was like they were all waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the silence, coming from one of the nearby tents. The veteran's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he and Reyes rushed toward the noise, rifles in hand, ready for anything. When they reached the tent, they found one of the soldiers, his face pale and terrified, backing away from something on the ground. The veteran quickly stepped inside, his rifle raised, but what he saw made his blood run cold. It was a creature like the one he had seen in the woods, lying motionless on the ground. Its body was covered in strange markings, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The veteran's heart raced as he approached it slowly. What is this? Reyes whispered, his voice shaking. I don't know, the veteran replied, his voice tight. But it's connected to the mark on my arm. It's all connected. As he knelt down to examine the creature, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The symbol that was carved into the floor of the cabin. It was on the creature's body too. This is what's been stalking us, the veteran said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's all part of whatever is happening here. Before they could react, the creature suddenly stirred, its eyes snapping open, glowing brighter than before. It let out a low, guttural growl, and in that instant, the veteran knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever was happening, it was far from over, and it was coming for them. Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto the veteran as it slowly began to rise from the floor. Its body, covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and change with every passing second, let out a low growl. The air around them felt thick with tension, and the veteran's heart was pounding in his chest. Without thinking, he raised his rifle, ready to fire if the creature made a move. Reyes stood close behind him, his own rifle aimed at the creature, but neither of them pulled the trigger. They were both frozen, unsure of what to do next. The creature was unlike anything they had seen before, unnatural, otherworldly, and connected to the strange symbol they had found. The creature's eyes flickered, almost as if it was trying to understand them. Its body shuddered, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate, like it was deciding whether or not to attack. What is this thing? Reyes whispered, his voice shaking. What does it want? The veteran didn't answer immediately. He was too busy trying to process what was happening. The creature's presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. And yet it was there, standing in front of them, like it was waiting for something. Before he could think any more, the creature let out another growl and lunged forward. The veteran instinctively fired his rifle, the shot ringing out in the quiet camp. The bullet hit the creature's shoulder, but it barely flinched. Instead, it let out a piercing scream, a sound that seemed to echo in the veteran's head. The creature didn't stop. It charged at them with terrifying speed, knocking both the veteran and Reyes to the ground. The rifle was knocked out of the veteran's hands, and for a moment he was disoriented, trying to regain his footing. Reyes was already scrambling to get up, reaching for his own weapon. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, its movements erratic and wild. The veteran scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The creature wasn't just a wild animal. It was controlled by something powerful, something they didn't understand. Reyes fired again, hitting the creature in the chest. This time, the creature staggered back, its body convulsing in pain. But it wasn't enough. It didn't slow down. It was relentless, like it couldn't feel pain. "We have to stop it," the veteran said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to find out how to stop it before it kills us." The creature charged again, but this time the veteran had an idea. He grabbed a nearby piece of metal, something sharp, and threw it at the creature's chest. The creature hesitated, its eyes flashing as the metal struck it. For a moment it seemed to freeze in place, as if the impact had disrupted whatever was controlling it. The veteran took his chance. He ran toward the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he'd only had one shot at this. He reached for his knife and plunged it into the creature's side, just below the ribs. The creature let out another terrible scream, but this time it didn't move. It collapsed to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing as if the life was draining from it. The veteran pulled the knife out quickly, stepping back as the creature's body began to disintegrate, breaking apart into dust before his eyes. The silence in the camp was deafening as the creature's body vanished, leaving nothing behind but the smell of decay. The veteran stood there, his hands shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Reyes slowly approached him, his rifle still in hand, but his face was pale. What the hell was that? The veteran didn't answer at first. He was too stunned by what he had just witnessed. The creature, whatever it was gone, but the feeling that something bigger was at play remained. He looked down at his arm, at the mark that had started it all. It was still there, still spreading, still growing. But now it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost as if it was reacting to what had just happened. "I think we're getting closer to the truth," the veteran said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of dread and determination. "But there's still so much we don't understand. The mark, the creature, the whispers, they're all connected. And I don't think we've seen the last of them." Reyes nodded slowly, his face hardening with resolve. "We need to find out who did this. Someone has to know what's going on." The veteran's mind was racing. They were closer, but there were still too many questions. Who was behind this? What was controlling the creatures? And what did it all have to do with the mark on his arm? The answers were out there, but finding them was going to be a dangerous path, and they were running out of time. The veteran and Reyes spent the next few days in a state of uneasy silence, trying to recover from the encounter with the creature. But even as they rested, the sense of urgency never left them. The mark on the veteran's arm had continued to spread, now covering nearly his entire body. It felt like something was growing inside him, a force that was slowly taking over. They had to find answers. The creature was just the beginning, and the veteran knew that whatever was behind it was only going to get worse. They decided to head back to the cabin they had discovered earlier. The symbol carved into the floor had to mean something. It was the only lead they had, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. If they didn't find the answers soon, they feared the creature would be the least of their worries. As they approached the cabin, the veteran's heart began to race. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy. It was the same feeling he had gotten when they'd first entered the woods, when they had found the mark on his arm. The feeling that something was watching them. "We need to be careful," the veteran said quietly as they reached the cabin. "Something's not right." Reyes nodded, his grip tight on his rifle. They stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for any signs of danger. The cabin looked the same as it had before, dusty, abandoned, and decaying. But there was an added tension in the air, as if it was holding its breath. The veteran knelt by the symbol on the floor, examining it again. It was still just as strange as before, but now it seemed to be calling to him, pulling at him from the inside. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edges of the carved design. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, and the air seemed to hum with energy. The veteran's heart raced as he stood up, looking around the room. Something was happening. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and for the first time since all this began, the veteran felt a surge of terror. This figure wasn't like the others they had seen. This was something different, something far more dangerous. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the veteran's mark flared with a bright, blinding light. The figure smiled, and it was then that the veteran realized the truth. He wasn't just marked, he was chosen. And whatever had chosen him, whatever was controlling everything, was not done yet. The veteran stood frozen in the cabin, staring at the figure that had just stepped out of the shadows. His heart was racing, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. The figure before him was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't human. It was tall, its body covered in the same strange symbols that had appeared on his arm. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, and it seemed to radiate a sense of power that sent a chill down the veteran's spine. Reyes, standing beside the veteran, took a step back, his rifle raised and ready. He wasn't sure what this thing was, but he knew it wasn't friendly. The figure smiled, a cold, unsettling grin that didn't reach its eyes. "So, you finally made it," it said, its voice low and smooth like it was enjoying the tension in the air. "What the hell are you?" the veteran demanded, his voice sharp and full of anger. The figure's smile widened. "I am the one who chose you. The mark on your arm, the creature you've seen, the whispers, they're all part of my plan. You were never meant to escape this." The veteran's hand tightened around the rifle in his grip, but he didn't raise it. He was trying to keep his cool, trying to understand what was happening. "What do you want from us?" The figure stepped closer, its red eyes never leaving the veteran's face. "I don't want anything from you. You're just a pawn, a part of something much bigger. The mark you carry is the key to bringing about a new era, one where my power will rule." Reyes shifted uncomfortably, his grip on his rifle tightening. "This mark, it's not just a symbol, it's a curse." The figure laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "A curse? No, it's not a curse. It's a gift. You are chosen, and you have been marked as my vessel. The mark will spread until it takes over your entire body, and you will become one with me." The veteran's blood ran cold. He could feel the mark on his body, the way it was growing, spreading, crawling under his skin. He had tried to ignore it, but now it was clear. He wasn't just being haunted by it, he was becoming it. "You won't control me," the veteran spat, his voice full of defiance. He wasn't going to let this thing win. He had come too far to let it take everything from him. The figure's grin faded and its expression turned cold. "You don't have a choice. The mark is already a part of you. It's too late for you to turn back. But don't worry, you won't be alone. There are others like you, who are destined to serve me." Before the veteran could react, the figure raised a hand, and a blast of dark energy shot out toward him. It hit him square in the chest, knocking him back against the wall of the cabin. Pain exploded through his body, and for a moment he thought he was going to lose consciousness. But he fought through it, pushing himself up and forcing himself to focus. Reyes fired his rifle, the bullets hitting the figure, but it didn't seem to faze it. The figure barely flinched, its eyes glowing brighter as it watched them. "You're wasting your time," the figure said, its voice cold and mocking. "You can't defeat me. I am too powerful." The veteran gritted his teeth, trying to ignore the pain. He wasn't going to let this thing have control over him. He had fought too hard, and he wasn't going to lose now. "Reyes, we need to break the curse," the veteran said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "The mark, it's the key. We have to destroy it." Reyes nodded, understanding what the veteran meant. He quickly pulled out a small, jagged rock from his pack and threw it toward the figure. It hit the floor in front of the creature, creating a loud noise. The figure turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted. The veteran took the opportunity. With all his strength, he lunged at the figure, using the last of his energy to tackle it. The creature stumbled back, surprised by the veteran's sudden attack. The veteran's hand shot out, grabbing the figure's arm and pulling it down to the floor. For a brief moment, it was just the two of them, struggling on the ground. The veteran's grip on the figure tightened, and he could feel the mark on his arm throbbing, burning with an energy that wasn't his own. It was almost as if the creature's power was flowing through him. With one last, desperate move, the veteran reached for his knife and drove it into the figure's chest. The creature screamed in pain, its body convulsing before it began to disintegrate, just like the other creatures they had seen. The power that had once filled the cabin seemed to drain away, leaving only silence in its wake. The veteran sat back, gasping for breath. His body was shaking from the fight, but he had done it. The creature was gone, and the mark on his arm. It was still there, but it no longer felt like it was in control. It was as if the connection between him and the creature had been severed, leaving him free. Reyes walked over, checking to make sure the creature was truly gone. Is it over? The veteran looked down at the mark on his arm, still visible but no longer pulsing with the same dark energy. I don't know, but we stopped it for now. But even as he said it, he knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much they didn't understand. The mark, the creatures, and the figure. It was all part of something much bigger. And whatever it wasn't done yet. After the battle in the cabin, the veteran and Reyes had spent a few days recovering. The creature they had fought had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the strange symbol on the floor and the memory of the fight. But the veteran knew they couldn't relax just yet. There was still too much they didn't know, and the mark on his arm was still there, though it no longer felt like it was in control. The camp had returned to a sort of uneasy normalcy, but it was clear that the atmosphere had changed. The soldiers who had once seemed tense and afraid now looked at the veteran with a mixture of fear and respect. It wasn't just the mark on his arm that made them look at him differently. It was the way he had fought the creature, the way he had refused to back down. But the veteran didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had barely escaped something much worse. He wasn't sure if the mark would ever leave him. He wasn't sure if the creature was truly gone. But one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to the life he had known before. As he sat alone by the campfire, staring at the flames, he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the creatures, the figure in the cabin, and the mark. He had been chosen, but for what? He didn't know yet, but he was determined to find out. Reyes walked over and sat next to him, breaking his thoughts. What now? He asked quietly. The veteran glanced at his friend, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know, but we've seen the worst of it, and whatever happens next, we have to be ready. Reyes nodded, understanding what the veteran meant. We'll stick together. We'll figure this out. The veteran smiled, a small, tired smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt like there might be a chance for them to make it through. The mark on his arm was still there, still a reminder of everything that had happened. But he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He had fought the darkness and won. But the journey wasn't over. The mark had been just the beginning. The veteran knew that there was more to this story, and whatever came next, he would face it head-on. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was something more. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready for whatever came next. The veteran couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't over. The camp had become a place of quiet unease, where every rustling leaf or crackling branch made the veteran tense. Even though they had defeated the creature in the cabin, the mark on his arm still burned, a constant reminder of what he had gone through, and what might still be waiting for him. Reyes had noticed the change in him too. You're not the same, he said one evening as they sat together near the campfire. You've been different since that creature went away. The veteran stared into the fire, his fingers tracing the mark that still spread across his arm. I'm not sure what's happening anymore. The mark, it feels like it's alive, changing with me. But it's not controlling me, at least not like before. Reyes looked at the veteran, a serious expression on his face. Do you think the mark's connected to all this? The creatures, the figure, the whispers. The veteran nodded slowly. I think so, and I don't think it's over yet. There's more to this than we realize. It had been quiet for a few days, but now, as the veteran sat by the fire, he could feel something stirring in the air again. The whispers he'd heard before had stopped for a while, but now they were coming back. They were faint at first, like a soft murmur carried on the wind, but the veteran knew what they were. He glanced around the camp. Nothing looked different. The soldiers went about their routines, unaware of the danger creeping closer. But the veteran felt it, a presence on the edges of the camp, something moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Reyes noticed the veteran's tense expression. "What is it? What's wrong?" The veteran's voice was low and steady. "It's the mark. It's starting again." Reyes stood up, his face filled with concern. "What do we do?" "We wait, but we stay ready," the veteran replied, his gaze fixed on the shadows in the distance. "Whatever happens next, we're not going to be caught off guard." That night, as the camp settled down, the veteran lay in his tent, trying to sleep, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. The whispers were louder now, clearer. He could almost make out the words, but they didn't make sense. It was as if the voices were calling him, urging him to do something, to go somewhere. He sat up in bed, his hand instinctively moving to the mark on his arm. It was burning again, pulsing with an unnatural heat. Something was happening, something was about to break. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Suddenly, a loud, shrill sound pierced the night air. The veteran jumped to his feet, his heart racing. It was a scream, distant but full of terror. He heard movement outside his tent, soldiers rushing to their posts, readying themselves for whatever was coming. The veteran grabbed his rifle, rushing out of the tent, his mind focused. He knew what this was. He'd been waiting for it. The mark, the whispers, they had all been leading to this moment. The camp was in chaos, soldiers shouting as they tried to organize themselves. The veteran's eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The whispers were louder now, coming from all directions. He could feel it, the presence drawing closer. Then from the trees at the edge of the camp, a shadow appeared. It was tall and dark, just like the creature from before. The veteran's heart skipped a beat. But this time it wasn't just one figure. There were more figures moving in the shadows, coming toward the camp. The veteran shouted to the soldiers, rallying them to defend the camp. But it was too late. The figures had already reached the perimeter, and the battle was beginning. The veteran knew they couldn't win this fight. They had faced monsters before, but this time it was different. The creatures weren't just physical. They were tied to the mark, to the very curse that was slowly consuming him. "We need to get out of here," the veteran shouted to Reyes as he fired his rifle into the darkness. "We can't fight them all." Reyes nodded, fear and determination in his eyes. "Where do we go?" "Anywhere but here," the veteran said, his voice grim. "We need to find out what's really behind all of this." As the creatures charged, the veteran and Reyes fought their way through the chaos, moving toward the edge of the camp. They couldn't stay and fight. It was too dangerous. They needed answers, and they weren't going to find them here. The veteran looked down at his arm again, at the mark that had been with him since the beginning. It was still there, still spreading. And now it seemed to glow with a strange, otherworldly light. It wasn't just a mark. It was the key to everything. They ran into the darkness, the sounds of battle fading behind them, but the feeling of being hunted remained. They ran through the woods for what felt like hours, the sounds of battle slowly fading behind them. The creatures hadn't followed them, but the veteran could feel their presence in the air. It was like they were being watched, hunted. The mark on his arm burned brighter with every step they took. Reyes was breathing heavily beside him. "Where are we going? What's the plan?" The veteran didn't answer right away. He didn't have a plan. He was as lost as Reyes. They couldn't go back to camp, not with the creatures still out there. And they couldn't hide forever. They needed answers, and he wasn't sure where to find them. But then something caught his eye. A faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the trees. The veteran's heart skipped a beat. He knew that glow. It was the same strange light that had surrounded the creature in the cabin. "Do you see that?" the veteran asked, pointing toward the light. Reyes squinted, nodding. "Yeah. What is it?" The veteran didn't know, but he felt a strange pull toward it. The mark on his arm seemed to react to the light, burning brighter, more intensely. "I think we need to go there," the veteran said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. They moved toward the light, every step feeling like it took them deeper into some kind of trap. But the veteran couldn't ignore the pull. The mark on his arm was leading him here, and he had to know why. As they approached the source of the light, the trees parted, revealing a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, something old, something powerful. The light was coming from a symbol carved into the stone, the same symbol that had appeared on the veteran's arm. "This is it," the veteran whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. "This is the source of everything." Reyes stood beside him, his voice trembling. "What does it mean?" The veteran stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward the symbol. As his fingers brushed against the stone, the mark on his arm flared with intense heat, and a voice stilled his mind. "You have come to claim your destiny. You are the key to the power that will shape the world. But first, you must make your choice." The voice was ancient, filled with power and authority. The veteran's heart pounded in his chest as he understood what it was saying. He had been marked for a reason, chosen for something beyond his understanding. But now the choice was his. Would he embrace the power of the mark, or would he destroy it and end the curse forever? As he stood there, facing the symbol, he realized that whatever choice he made, it would change everything. The mark, the creatures, the battle, it had all led him here, and now he had to decide what kind of future he wanted to shape. The veteran closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him. And for the first time in a long time, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it.